The most infamous question to ever be asked is the Jewish question. It's a question that ultimately culminated in Hitler's final solution, his answer to the Jewish question. The Jewish question was debated from the 18th century through the 20th century, indeed, perhaps even until today. And it had to do with the question of the place of Jews in modern society, in the modern state, predominantly around the questions of emancipation and the rights of Jews to be considered as equal citizens to all other people in the places wherever they lived. Incredibly, the question really first began here in London, and in a sense, right here in Bevis Marks Synagogue. The language of the Jewish question began in 1750 with what became known as the Jew Bill. It was a bill debated in Parliament, at first approved and then ultimately rescinded, that gave the ability for foreign-born Jews to acquire citizenship. Of course, if you were born here, you were a citizen, but not necessarily if you were born elsewhere, unless you had had a significant financial contribution, as it were, you were doing significant business and so on. And then there was the question about the ability to, in a sense, acquire the rights of citizenship. That was, as I mentioned, first passed, and then there was a huge uproar, created a significant amount of controversy, and it was ultimately repealed in 1753. And it's during those debates, which really had to do with people who were attending Bevis Marks Synagogue, foreign-born merchants, perhaps coming from the Netherlands or from Italy, who had settled in London. This was now their home, who wanted to have the rights of being a citizen. And it was during those debates in Parliament, in the press, in society, around the ability of Jews, and again here it's not dealing with Jews in general, it was specifically foreign-born Jews, but it took on the contours of a general debate around the rights of Jews, that you have the emergence of this idea of the Jewish question. But this question really takes on greater force in the 19th century, when you have the nation-state building post-Napoleon, where you have the, shall we say, the application of humanist ideology coming into conflict with the question of, well, what about the rights of Jews? And the rights of Jews to have equality in the places where they lived. And of course, there were those who supported such an endeavor, and there were those who opposed it, who said that no, Jews can't be equal citizens. And so it's in that context where you have Bruno Breuer writing in 1840 in Germany a work entitled The Jewish Question, on whether Jews who still maintained the Jewish religion could be part of the modern secular state. And then you have the response to the Jewish question that was written by Karl Marx, where he addresses the ability for Jews to be part of society, the questions around capitalism. You see the beginning of his thoughts around capitalism and the Jews, which has, of course, become quite nefarious. But really it continues throughout the century, this question of the rights of Jews. And it takes on, shall we say, added quality or added characteristic as you, shall we say, move further east, from London to Western Central Europe and ultimately to Eastern Europe, where you have really quite explicit persecutions against Jews in the Pale Settlement in Russia, a huge amount of poverty, and the broader question of, what is the future of the Jews in Europe? And ultimately, as we began, the most nefarious answer was that put forward by Hitler, Yimach Shemo, who decided that the answer to that question is the final solution. which was simply to exterminate, to murder all the Jews of Europe. But what's interesting is that throughout that century, throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, this question wasn't only asked and answered by non-Jews, it was also asked and answered by Jews. Jews were also concerned with their own state, their own, shall we say, their own state of equality within the places that they lived, but were also significantly concerned around what the answer would be for Jews who lived in a state of ongoing persecution in Eastern Europe and incredible amounts of poverty, lack of education, and the question of, what is the answer to that Jewish question, right? The future of Jews within these places. And what you find is that different Jewish people provided different answers to this question. And it's answers that evolved throughout the course of the 19th century. It's answered by people in London, Sir Moses Montefiore. It's then looked at in Western Europe by figures like Baron Hirsch and eventually Theodor Herzl. And in a sense, it culminates with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And so it also spans a very long time, and lots of different approaches were taken to this question. This course will also really be a history lesson into Jewish life in Europe in the 19th century and the way that their lives were changing over the course of that century with the technologies that had become dominant, with the methods not just of communication, but also of travel, and the way that these places were becoming increasingly linked to one another, that allowed Jews in different parts of the world to, in a sense, really think about how they could alleviate, or how they could alleviate the suffering of Jews in other places, but how they could play a proactive role in answering a question that maybe didn't immediately impact them personally, but that they felt they were in a position to, in a sense, attempt to answer on behalf of Jews in other places in the world. And so you find that throughout this century, the 19th century, and certainly you move into the 20th century, this globalization of Jewish care and concern that had always been core to Jewish identity, the sense of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, that all of Israel is, shall we say, responsible for one another, that has always been, shall we say, a really beautiful sentiment. But during the 19th century, it becomes a sense of responsibility, a duty, something that they actually are able to put into action and therefore become obligated, in a sense, to do so. And they do so. And they do think about these questions and think about how they can play an important role in helping their co-religionists who live in different places and in places that are very different from the places in which they live, whether that's in Paris or London or elsewhere. And so what I'm going to be looking at in this series is how did these different figures attempt to answer this question? What was their approach to how to resolve the Jewish question, the perpetual persecution and poverty of Jews in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, where you had millions of poverty-stricken Jewish people. And this provides for us almost, shall we say, a mirror for us to look at, now nearly 200 years later, at how those different approaches were taken. How did they succeed? Did they fail? What does it ultimately mean in our own time as we see a resurgence of anti-Semitism, of the questions of, where do Jews belong? In a sense, quite scary, but we have centuries to look back on as we try to untangle and to think about these questions within a contemporary context. And certainly during the weeks we find ourselves in, during the month of Elul, as we approach the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur, this is really, shall we say, an ideal time for us to be asking the hard questions, to be exploring the difficult answers to those hard questions, and to think about, what they meant then, but what they continue to mean now. And so I hope that you'll join me over the course of this series as we spend some time looking at these different figures, understanding their world, their context, but ultimately their approach to this significant question as we think about how they answered it and what those answers perhaps mean for us today. But something that we're going to find throughout this is actually how London and even Bevis Mark Synagogue plays a role kind of throughout this entire epic, through the significant people who are in this congregation, their involvement, obviously British Empire, and so forth. And so I think that will be a really interesting, shall we say, angle or frame for us to think around about those questions while being in this place that has meant so much to Jewish history over the past few centuries. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to exploring these questions and answers with you over the course of this series.